Blichmann Engineering recently announced a grain mill. I'm fortunate enough to have one here in the brew house. In this video, we're going to go through the assembly, some of the features, as well as a grain crush test. How's it going? My name's Brian. Welcome to another video. If this is your first time here and you'd like to learn more about electric brewing, see how-to videos and product reviews just like this one, consider subscribing, and if you do, don't forget to click that bell so you won't miss a video when it comes out. And while you're down there, if you don't mind, hit that like button. It really helps us with the YouTube algorithm. Full disclosure, as with all my reviews, Blichmann did send me the unit. I did not purchase it. What they actually sent me was the grain mill, the small hopper, the small stand, as well as the caster kit for the bottom of the small stand. Now, that seems like a lot of stuff. It actually came in 4 boxes, and I was pretty surprised whenever I saw the tracking information on it. I looked at the tracking information and it said 117 pounds, and I went, what? So I knew that I was in for something special whenever it got in. So let's take a look at the assembly of the unit. One tip I want to throw in here real quick before I get too far along with that is that I definitely recommend leaving everything loose and finger tight until you get everything all assembled. Just because of the fact the way that these things are made, sometimes if you get it tightened down, you're going to be forcing things to fit. In my situation, I left everything loose as I was going along. I started with the base plate first. There's some angle brackets that go onto the base plate MDF, and it just uses carriage bolts and nuts. The carriage bolts hold from the other side. You simply assemble those by putting all 4 of them on there. There's 2 long ones, 2 short ones. Then after you do that, you put the legs on. And you want to be aware of how you put the legs on. There are some braces that go on after you get the legs on. And if you look at the MDF base for the mill, the hole is actually offset to one side. And you want to make sure whenever you're putting the mill together that you have the offset to the front of the mill, which when you put your bracing on, you could put bracing on any of the legs, but because there are holes all the way around. But when you put the bracing on, make sure that the hole in the MDF is towards the front, and then you put the bracing on the back sides. After I got all the legs and everything built, put the MDF for the casters on top of that because it was flipped over, and then assemble the casters, and those are held on by 17mm locking nuts. And they do swivel, so when you go to put the nut on, one of the ways that you can hold the caster and keep the center nut or bolt from spinning is actually lock the caster into place, and when you do that, it actually prevents the center bolt from spinning. Once I was completed with the bottom portion of the legs and casters and everything, it was time to flip it over. Flipped it over and got ready to put the motor onto the platform. One of the things that I did do that is not in the instructions that I thought just might be nice to do was I took the Velcro tape that holds the dust shield on and marked out the places where the bolts were going to be that held the motor on, and actually cut out little scallops or little areas of the Velcro on the double stick tape, so that it would fit tighter around the bolts and not be up over top or have to put it outside of the bolts. Just something that I did that wasn't in the instructions, but I think it's advisable you can do. So once I got those measured and cut, it's time to install the motor. And again, that thing is a beast. So you put it up there, and then I just kind of laid it up there and then tilted it around until I could find the bolts, the holes for the bolts, which wasn't too big of a deal. Once you get the grain mill mounted on the MDF, the top board, one of the things you want to do before you put the hopper and all that stuff on is you want to actually set the mill gauge or set the mill up. And they do send a setup tool, and it is a 55/100 thick piece of stainless steel, or 1.44mm, I believe it is. And what you do is you put that in the mill, and you start at 18, which is the highest number or largest opening, and then roll it back until you get just a little bit of interference in the mill. And in my situation, it was 10. It comes with a sticker. You simply write the 10 on the sticker, which is supposed to be the optimal gap for the mill, and then you stick it to the mill. And then there's other lines and spaces in there where you can do different things. Like if you're using wheat, you might decide to use a larger opening in the mill, and you can put whatever you determine is the best setting for that. You can put that on there for future reference. So if you're milling something that's high wheat and you want to adjust it, you can go back and refer to your prior testing and experimentation to see what your setting was. So that's nice and handy to have that there. Now, once I got the motor mounted up on top of the top plate, I laid down on the ground and affixed the Velcro strips to the bottom side of that MDF board, putting it around the bolts as I had cut out. And then once I did that, then I attached the dust chute attachment to it, and that's pretty much how you do that. Once I was done with that, then it was time to put on the hopper. And again, like I said, I got the small hopper, so I started by putting the 2 wings on first, leaving everything loose just like I did with the stand, put the 2 sides on, and then lastly, you're going to install the finger guard. All right, so I got everything all assembled together. Let's talk a little bit about the features of the mill. One of the things that kind of stood out to me first was that it will do 12 pounds a minute. And that is amazingly fast. I mean, in my testing, which you'll see here in just a little bit, when I put the grain in, it was like, it just went right through it, no problem at all. Now, the way that it achieves that is it actually has 3-inch rollers, but they're not narrow like some competitors are. They're actually like 6-inch rollers. So you've got 6 inches of surface area that the grain is coming in contact with and going through. And that kind of leads us to another detail on the mill, and that is that both of the rollers are gear driven. So they run simultaneously at the same time, pulling the grain down through the mill. On some of your cheaper mills, like I have a monster mill, only one of the mill rollers is driven. And so the other mill just kind of comes along behind it and just rolls as it comes in contact with things. And that can create some shearing and tearing of husks. The other thing about the rollers is that they are hardened steel, which is like 5 times harder than stainless steel. And you might think, well, that's might be a problem because I condition my grain. I'm telling you, and you're going to see, you will no longer need to condition your grain because this thing does a superb job at crushing grain. The other thing that I really liked about it was that the mill speed is only 125 RPMs, but it is still a fast crush and it's a gentle crush. One of the things about the rollers is they have micro flutes on them, which is like it's a very, very fine texture on them, if you will. And I found that, with the crush, it's not tearing up the husk, it's not destroying anything. Some of the competition has large flutes in there which can tear and grab at grain husks. This just gently pulls it down through the mill. This thing does have infinite possibilities for the crush settings on it. It goes all the way from 1 to 18. I found in my experience, I'll show you some samples here in just a little bit, that I wouldn't go probably any tighter than 4. And probably no looser than 12 unless you just had some humongous wheat kernels or some kind of huge barley that you were crushing on there. But, it does have the possibility to go as wide or as narrow as you want. One of the other things I do like about the grain mill motor is that it's 120 volts AC. And so you don't need a power pack or anything to convert AC voltage to DC voltage in order to run the mill. Now on mine, I got the hopper that will hold 17 pounds of grain. They do make a larger hopper that will hold up to 60 pounds of grain, so you can run a whole bag of grain through this thing with no problem. It's not plastic as some of the competitors are. It is a nice galvanized steel. I mean, this thing is heavy duty. I mean, it's a substantial hopper that you're not going to have any issues with at all. One of the other things that I did like about it is the dust chute. So there's like a canvas apparatus that goes on the bottom underneath of the mill, and as you're milling your grain, it will actually keep the dust going straight down rather than, creeping out from underneath of the mill and getting all over everything in your brew house. As far as operation of the mill goes, it does have a forward and a reverse on it. Generally, they say you don't have to worry about putting it in reverse. It will start full, and there's no problem with that. I actually did have to engage it slightly when I had it at a really tight setting, but it was just a matter of flip it in reverse, flip it back to forward again, and the grain was flowing back through the mill again. No problem. All right, so let's talk about the crush, because I mean, it doesn't matter how pretty it is or how well made it is if it doesn't crush, right? It chews through the grain, and it's almost like it gums the grain, because it comes out, and I'll show you here, it comes out with just all of the husk pretty much intact. All of the grain inside is crushed. There's a minimal amount of flour, but virtually every single kernel that goes through the mill at that optimal setting that Blichmann has designed it for, everything is crushed perfectly. I couldn't find a kernel that was uncrushed and that didn't have the husk, probably at least 60 to 70% intact. Most of the time the hulls were split in half, but they were completely intact. Now I went through various settings on the mill. I went backwards and it has half steps. So, it has numbers on the steps, 10, 8, 6, 4. So I went backwards all the way to 4, skipping every half step basically, or every other step. And I found that on number 4, like I said earlier, it did kind of bind just a little bit for a second, and I flipped it in reverse and flipped it back on. So if you look here at the number 4 crush, it has some kernels in it that are kind of whole because I flipped it in reverse, and so some of the grain spilled up over the rollers. But for the most part, everything is still pretty much intact. It does generate a lot more flour with that. So I mean, if somebody is doing, say, a brew in a bag and they want a really fine crush, that number 4 crush is gosh, it probably would be the optimal for that. Number 6 was a little bit more flour. The kernels were crushed a little bit more, but again, there was still a lot of the husks intact from the grain. I mean, it almost looks like there's rice hulls in it. That's how much there was. Number 6 was the same way. I mean, it's, you know, just as you go down, it seemed like the husk stayed intact more at the 10 mark, but then as you went backwards down the scale, they were still intact for the most part, but it just started creating more flour from the grain. So, you know, kind of depending on what your efficiencies are and how you like to run your system and how, you know, how much throughput you get from your grain bed normally, you may find that one of those settings is better for you. But I tell you, on number 10, which was the one that they recommend, I was really, really happy with what I was seeing there. I did go up to 12 just to see, and that probably would be a good setting for if you're using like some larger kernel wheat or something like that. It did crush the grains pretty well. There was a lot less flour, almost none. Most of the kernels that I saw were crushed. It didn't, like, you know, knock them apart like it did at 10, but at 12 there was a good crush. And, you know, there was a minimal amount of flour, but I think even 12 would be a good setting. But, you know, personally for me, I like the setting that Blichmann says is optimal. As far as noise, this thing is super quiet. Let's listen to a test here, and I'm going to leave this lapel mic on and just kind of show you exactly how quiet it is running a little bit of grain through it. And it's very, very quiet. So let's listen to that now. All right, so I've got about a pound of grain. Actually, this is a little bit more than a pound of grain. I've got a bucket underneath of there, which incidentally, this thing does hold up to 7.5 gallon buckets underneath on the small stand. Probably could get a little bit larger bucket than that underneath of there, but that's what I've got underneath there. So let's go ahead and flip this thing on. I've got the setting on 10, which I think is the optimal setting. Crank it on. And I'm standing right here by the mill. Done. That was so fast. And it is really quiet, actually. You know, I don't know how it sounds as far as to you on your audio device you're listening on, whether it's your phone or whatever, but this thing is really quiet. It's a lot quieter than a drill and a roller mill like I currently have. Now, just for, you know, giggles, here's a comparison of my current mill side by side with the Blichmann grain mill. It looks like a toy mill. It's unbelievable how substantial this thing is. And it's got a pretty large footprint, so if you're, you know, if you're shy on space, just be aware of that. But, you know, I tell you what, this thing is absolutely amazing. I know they put a lot of time into engineering this and spent a lot of time testing it, and it really shows. I mean, you know, I tell you, is it for everyone? No, probably not. If you're just brewing like 2.5 to 5 gallon batches, you know, once or twice a month, probably not the mill for you. But if you're a home brewer and you're brewing, you know, a couple of 5 gallon batches a weekend, or even 10, 20, I know some people even have, you know, full barrel systems, you got to take a look at this thing. And I think the biggest thing for me that is a plus on this thing is it looks like it's going to be a good, consistent crush that you can count on. That's going to, I mean, I think it's going to have a lot of flow. So, you know, I'm going to do a beer with this milling the grain coming up. I'll obviously report back on that, but everything I see, I mean, it certainly looks like a thumbs up. So if you enjoyed the video, give us a thumbs up. We certainly appreciate that. Hit that subscribe button. This has been Brian for Short Circuited Brewers. We'll see you on the next video.